In 203 BC, the Senate met to discuss the progress of the war and allocate resources. Scipio's command was extended indefinitely, until the war in Africa was concluded. In addition, the Senate raised 3,000 soldiers for service in Sicily, since all the troops that had been previously stationed there were now in Africa. Supplies from every corner of the Republic were dispatched to Sicily, where they could be forwarded on to Africa. Meanwhile, Scipio, from his heavily fortified camp, kept a watchful eye on Hasdrubal Gisco and Syphax, who were camped nearby. For the moment, neither side seemed too interested in a general engagement. Hasdrubal wanted more reinforcements, and Scipio was outnumbered. While there was a lull in the fighting, King Syphax wanted to open up negotiations with the Romans to see if a peace agreement could be reached. Scipio was at first resistant to negotiate, but then warmed up to the idea, since it would allow his soldiers to take note of the enemy fortifications. Livy writes, quote, "The envoys who were sent to Syphax were accompanied by some first-rank centurions who were disguised as camp servants. While the envoys were in conference, these men strolled about the camp, noting all of the exits, the general arrangement of the camp, the positions of the Carthaginians and Numidians, and the distance between Hasdrubal's camp and that of Syphax. They also watched the methods adopted in posting the watches and guards, to see whether a surprise attack would be better made by day or night." The Roman spies reported that both enemy camps consisted of simple huts constructed from highly flammable materials. The huts were constructed only out of reeds with roofs made out of grass matting. Scipio saw an opportunity to potentially burn down one, if not both, of the camps. He now summoned a council of war to decide the overall strategy. It was decided that Massinissa and Lelilis would start the fires in Syphax's camp. Once Scipio observed the king's camp ablaze, he would then launch his own assault on the Carthaginian camp. Livy describes the event. Quote, "Scipio had not to wait long, for when the fire was cast on the nearest huts, it very soon caught the next ones, and then running along in all directions, spread over the whole camp. Such an extensive fire breaking out at night naturally produced alarm and confusion. But Syphax's men, thinking it was due to accident and not to the enemy, rushed out without arms to try and extinguish it. They found themselves at once confronted by an armed foe, mainly Numidians who Massinissa, already thoroughly acquainted with the arrangement of the camp, had posted in places where they could block all the avenues. Some were caught in the flames while half asleep in their beds. Others fled recklessly, scrambling over one another, and were trampled to death in the camp gates." End quote. From their nearby camp, the Carthaginians noticed the fire, but also thought it was an accident, and failed to see the enemy nearby. Quote, "Not in the least expecting the presence of an enemy, they rushed out, each through the gate nearest to him, without any weapons, carrying out what might help to extinguish the flames, and so came right on the Roman army. The Carthaginians were all cut down, for the enemy gave no quarter, that none might escape and give the alarm. In the confusion, the gates were left unguarded, and Scipio at once seized them, and fire was flung upon the nearest huts. The flames broke out at first in different places, but creeping from hut to hut, in a very few moments wrapped the whole camp in one vast inferno. Men and animals alike, scorched with heat, blocked the passages to the gates and fell crushed by each other. Those whom the fire did not overtake perished by the sword, and the two camps were involved in one common destruction. Both the generals, however, saved themselves, and out of all those thousands, only 2,000 infantry and 500 cavalry made good their escape, the majority being wounded or suffering from the fire. 40,000 men perished either from the fire or the enemy. Over 5,000 were taken alive, including many Carthaginian nobles, of whom 11 were senators, 174 standards were captured, 2,700 horses, and 6 elephants, 8 others having been killed or burnt to death." End quote. Hasdrubal sought refuge in a nearby city. He did not linger long, as he was concerned the city might open their gates to the Romans, which is exactly what happened. Scipio would seize 2 more cities and sack another. With no serious opposing force standing in his way, he resumed his siege of Utica. Back in Carthage, the Senate convened an emergency session. 3 proposals were offered. First, send envoys to Scipio to negotiate a peace. Second, recall Hannibal from Italy. Third, reinforce the army to its proper strength and send an appeal to Syphax urging him not to abandon hostilities with the Romans. The Barca faction, along with Hasdrubal Gisco, threw their support behind the third proposal, which was subsequently adopted. 4,000 Celta-Iberians were recruited from Iberia to bolster the army. Livy indicates these were crack troops. The arrival of these Iberians significantly restored Carthage's shaken confidence. Despite the setback, Syphax remained steadfast in his support for the Carthaginian cause. Livy writes, quote, "He was well aware that he owed his defeat to fire, and not to the chances of battle. It was only the man who vanquished by arms that was inferior in war." A few days later, Hasdrubal and Syphax joined forces. Their united strength amounted to about 30,000 troops. End quote. With their new army in place, Hasdrubal and Syphax decided to confront the Romans. It had only been a few months after the disaster at Utica. Meanwhile, Scipio, who was pressing on with the siege against Utica, received intelligence that a fresh Carthaginian army was on the horizon. He decided to leave a small contingent to maintain the assault against Utica. He then led the main army in a rapid march to the Great Plains to counter this new threat. Livy describes the initial action. Quote, "The Romans' first position was on a hill some 4 miles distant from Syphax's camp. The next day he marched his cavalry down into a place called Magni Campi, a stretch of level country extending from the foot of the hill, and spent the day riding up to the enemy's outposts and harassing them with skirmishes. For the next 2 days, both sides kept up this aimless fighting without any result worth mentioning. On the 4th day, both sides came down to battle." End quote. Hasdrubal Gisco set up his forces in the following manner. He placed his best troops, the Iberians, in the middle. To the left and right of the Iberians was the Carthaginian infantry and the Numidian infantry. These were the remnants left over from the Battle of Utica. Located on the farthest right were the Carthaginian cavalry, and on the farthest left, there was the Numidian cavalry. Both the Numidian infantry and Numidian cavalry were under the control of Syphax. Scipio set up his forces in the following manner. 2 Roman legions were placed in the center, with 1 allied legion on the left and 1 on the right. They were deployed 3 lines deep, which of course was the typical Roman standard. On the left were Massinia and his Numidian cavalry, and on the right were the Roman cavalry. The action began with cavalry units from both sides charging each other. The Roman cavalry in short order routed Syphax's horse, and on the other side, the Carthaginian cavalry was completely routed by Massinissa. They were chased and pursued off the battlefield. Things didn't go much better for the Numidian and Carthaginian infantry, as they were routed by both Roman allied legions. Once again, the Carthaginian and Numidian units were pursued off the battlefield. That left the Iberians to face off against the Roman legions. The first line of Roman infantry, the Hastati, were holding their own against the Iberians. Upon seeing this, Scipio decided to break with the usual Roman tactic of relieving the first line with the second line of Roman infantry. Instead, he had the second and third lines of each legion attack the Iberians in the flank and rear. Despite being surrounded, the Iberians fought to the bitter end and were annihilated. So, in just the course of a few months, the gross mismanagement of Hasdrubal Gisco and Syphax had led to the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers. Both generals managed to escape yet again, but the surviving elements of their army deserted. We will continue on in the next video.